Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We have just about a minute until we'll get started, so we can start exactly at noon Central Time. Thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So hello, and thank you for joining the Center for Financial Security for our webinar today. How does housing assistance affect supplemental security income application for people with disabilities? My name is Hallie Leinhart. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Financial Security here at UW-Madison. And just to give a bit of a rundown on our format today, we will start with the research background, methodology, and findings presented first up, and then we'll move into discussions of study findings and implications more broadly. And then we'll continue with a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to submit your questions in that question chat box that's located at the right side of your screen. And you can do that throughout the webinar. So I'm very excited to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. We have Eric Embry, and he is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's also an affiliate of the Center for Financial Security. We have Kathleen Moore. She's a social scientist on contract at HHS with the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. That's Health and Human Services. And then we have Arthur Jacobs, and he's a housing coordinator with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. Thank you all for being here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Embry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hallie, and thank you to everyone who is here listening into the webinar today. I'm happy to talk about a research project I've been working on with Carly Urban at Montana State, titled Housing Assistance and SSI Participation. Next slide, please. With a quick disclaimer that this was funded by Social Security and doesn't express their needs in particular. You can read that disclaimer, but next slide, please. So overall, this project is going to be about the interaction between two programs, housing assistance and SSI. So just as a brief introduction, I want to mention housing assistance. So this is a big program in the U.S. About 5 million households receive either public housing or subsidized housing, which can kind of together be called housing assistance. There's a number of smaller programs as well that could be included. But if you're a household that receives it, it's a pretty valuable benefit. On average, you receive almost $8,000 worth of annual benefits from it. So that's, say, more than twice as much as the average household receives from SNAP benefits if you're on SNAP or food stamps. So it's a pretty big and valuable benefit if you get it, but it's unique within the U.S. social safety net. And so it's kind of characterized by two unique aspects. One is that there's a lot of local control. So there are a couple thousand public housing authorities in the U.S., and each of them have a fair amount of autonomy to set eligibility criteria, and in particular determine who receives housing assistance within their area. And so kind of combined with this local control, you have this other really unique aspect of housing assistance, which is that it's characterized by rationing, which just means that there's a lot more households eligible for housing assistance than actually receive it. So only about 10 to 20% of households who are income eligible for housing assistance actually receive housing assistance. And so by rationing, what we're referring to is there's a big pool of people who are eligible for it, but somebody, typically the local public housing authority or housing authority, gets to determine who among this large pool of applicants actually gets to receive the benefit. Next, please. And so just as a nice anecdote, here in Chicago, to see how this can work, when the waiting list for Section 8 housing vouchers were opened in 2014, the Chicago Housing Authority received 260,000 applications, which is fully a quarter of the population of Chicago, essentially. So a ton of applications flooded in, and even among people who wanted this assistance, only about 45,000, or say 20%, were even eligible to get on the waiting list or chosen to go on the waiting list. Once they're on the waiting list, even that doesn't guarantee that you get a voucher. On average, it takes about 4 years to go from being on the wait list to receiving housing assistance. And I ran across this article in the Chicago Sun-Times, which was talking about this a really long time period between potentially receiving housing assistance and actually doing it. But there was this select group of people, about 1,000 households, were kind of chosen to jump to the front of the line. And essentially within 5 months, this group had gone from not having an application to being put into a home through housing assistance. And this was a group that had a large number of disabled veterans, and so they were kind of given this priority access to receiving housing assistance, which again is perfectly fine and can be a good idea, but when you have this rationing and you have to choose who receives housing assistance and who doesn't, it might create some incentives for people who might want housing assistance. Next, please. And so kind of similarly, this is a picture I took when I was at the DMV one day where there was this really long line, and I'd been waiting in the line for about an hour, and what was happening was that you have this really long line to go up to the front, but there's this side line where, as you can see from the sign here, any senior citizens, expectant mothers, or people with disabilities can kind of go to the sideline and skip the rest of the line. And so there's good reasons to give these people priority access, but what happened when you had this really long line was essentially I stood in it for an hour and it never moved. And so with me, this ended up that I ended up not coming back, and my wife came back later because she was an expectant mother and she was able to move to the front of the line. But when you're standing in this really long line and you have this valuable benefit waiting for you, you start to look for ways in which you might be able to move in the front. This is kind of an inefficiency of having a really long line. And so we've at least started to think about how giving priority access to people with disabilities can really serve as a nice benefit for them as well. And so we've been trying to think about how this interaction between housing assistance and people with disabilities has changed over the past few decades in the U.S. Next. And so the research question that we're looking at in this paper is, first, we want to understand how much more likely are households with a disability to receive housing assistance. So just kind of measuring, is this just nothing, or do we actually see a big benefit being provided to households with a disability? And then we're trying to see, well, if you're in an area that gives priority access to housing assistance to households with a disability, does that end up increasing the rate of people who apply for disability benefits, and in particular for SSI, or Supplemental Security Income? And then kind of secondarily, we're looking to see if there's any spillover effects on other programs. So in particular, looking at the TANF program, where you might think that people who would have been eligible for TANF benefits might instead apply for SSI benefits, and in part because it has a greater financial benefit to it. And so we're just looking for those potential spillover effects. Next slide. So we're talking about program interaction. The other program we're really interested in here is SSI, Supplemental Security Income. This is another big program in the U.S. There's about 8 million recipients among 3 groups that it serves. It serves children with disabilities, adults with disabilities, and then the elderly or aged population. And this is just any low-income elderly household. You can see from the graph that there's been a pretty big increase in the SSI population over the past 20 to 30 years. So there's been a 70% rise since 1990, and almost all of that has come from the non-aged population, so either more children or adults with disabilities. And one thing that's at least really interesting to me learning in this process is that most new SSI recipients between the ages of 5 to 49 actually qualify with a mental disability as opposed to a physical disability. So there's really been a large shift in the composition of households that receive SSI over time. Next. So this paper is going to first kind of create a new novel indirect measure of this disabled housing assistance preference. And so at the metro area, we're going to try and measure the benefit provided to households with and without a disability. And this will be kind of summarizing this really actually complex network of policies and procedures at the local level, but we're just trying to measure kind of the net or indirect effect of this over time within a metro area. And then we're going to look at the interaction of that and application or receipt of SSI over time. And so other papers have found that SSI or disability insurance participation has been responsive to either economic conditions or to policy incentives. We see ourselves as kind of following this strain of literature, but looking at a previously looked over aspect of the policy incentives, which is that you might have this increased access to housing assistance. Next. So again, the way that we'll do this is first we want to create this indirect measure of local housing assistance policies. We're going to call this the Disabled Housing Assistance Value, or DHAV. And DHAV, again, is a dollar value that we're going to put on the expected benefits that a household would have from getting this label of being disabled, which is something that you could have verified if you go through the disability application procedure for SSI. And then the second part is we're going to use within MSA variation in the value of DHAV to estimate its effect on SSI and on TANF participation. Next. Just as a couple more policy details for SSI, again, we're focusing on the non-aged SSI population. This also provides a really nice benefit to households, up to $771 per month if you are a single person receiving SSI benefits. There are income and asset tests. So this is for a low-income population, and you have to have under $2,000 in assets. And so this is more targeted towards either single moms or single people, but much less likely to qualify if you're a married couple. There is kind of a costly application procedure or a large fixed cost moving on to SSI. So you can't have worked in a number of months, and you have to go through this process of verifying your disability through a doctor, and the application process just takes several months and takes a while to get on it. But it's also a federal program, so benefits are mostly set at the federal level, although there are some states that offer additional supplements, but it's supposed to be a pretty standardized process across all of the states and in particular across metro areas. Next. For housing assistance, the way that housing assistance works is that either for public housing or for a housing choice voucher, you'll be assigned a unit, or you get to pick a unit on the open market, and your rent is a function of your income. So typically you'll pay 30% of your income. And so if you're on SSI, that's going to mean you're going to pay approximately, say, $200 per month in rent, regardless of what, say, the market value of your unit is. And so this can be a really big benefit. On average, the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom unit is $1,100 per month. That's according to HUD, which sets kind of the maximum amount that someone with a housing choice voucher could spend on a unit. And so we kind of think of the difference between what the maximum you could spend on a unit is and what you pay in rent as the net benefit of being on housing assistance. And then once you receive a housing choice voucher, public housing, you're typically able to stay on that housing assistance until you either kind of give it up voluntarily or you might be disqualified for other reasons. But you can often receive it for a long period of time. Next. Like I mentioned earlier, this waiting list policy is determined by a local public housing authority. So some places just use a lottery, so it's just kind of a randomized process. But many use either a queue or kind of a very specific preference weighted system, where if you're in a certain category, something like if you're disabled or a veteran or the elderly, or if you're homeless, you are more likely to receive housing assistance or to receive it quicker. On average, once you're on a waiting list throughout the U.S., it takes 2.5 years before you are assigned a unit. And in addition to this queuing process, there are actually other ways that a public housing authority could preference disabled households relative to other households. One example is that you can receive a longer period of time to find a unit if you are disabled relative to non-disabled households. So we're, again, trying to get an indirect measure of the benefit that a public housing authority could give disabled households, but there's actually a number of other ways that public housing authorities could benefit disabled households. Next. So just our general prediction here is that if you are in an area where your DHAB increases, so that is, if you're in an area where once you move on SSI and you can say that you're disabled, you're much more likely to receive housing assistance, or if the value of that assistance goes up over time because rents or house prices are going up, then we're going to predict that conditional on everything else being the same, you would be more likely to apply or participate in SSI. And then similarly, we would expect a larger response to SSI participation if you're someone who has kind of a lower outside option. So either if there's lower labor market income in the area, or if you're a lower educated household, we might think that the benefits of receiving SSI and housing assistance is greater relative to working in the labor market. Or if there's lower kind of other social safety net benefits available through TANF or AFDC benefits, we might expect a higher response among, say, single people relative to married people. Next. So the way that we'll work this out empirically is we first want to measure this local housing assistance disability preference. Again, this is going to be an indirect measure that we take from observational data, but we're hoping that it kind of summarizes the policies in place. And so the way that we do this is first we get this measure of the likelihood of receiving housing assistance if you are a non-disabled household by metro area and by year. That's the H sub MT of 0. And then we're going to compare that to the likelihood of receiving housing assistance if you are a disabled household, and that's the HMT of 1. And the difference between these two measures is going to be what we call the local disability preference, or the increase in the probability of receiving housing assistance if you're disabled relative to non-disabled. Next. The way that we will measure this is we have an indicator of whether or not a household is receiving housing assistance or not. That's the HIT. And then we're going to have these fixed effects in here. So gamma MT is this metro by year fixed effect, which essentially is going to be picking up the likelihood of receiving housing assistance if you're a non-disabled household. The gamma D is going to be the change in receiving housing assistance if you report having a disability. So again, this is the H1 minus H0 that we talked about in the previous slide. And then we're going to control for all the demographic and policy variables that we can. So we'll control for things like household composition, if there's kids or if you're single, if you're men versus women, your age, your education, racial characteristics, and then policy variables such as the minimum wage or what AFDC benefits are available. Next. Once we have this gamma D, or the increase in the probability of receiving housing assistance, we multiply that by the fair market rent in the area to get the DHAV, or again, the expected annual benefit in dollar value of being a household that has this kind of label as disabled through SSI as opposed to not having it. Next. We are then going to use that DHAV variable and run a regression where we're predicting whether or not a household receives SSI. Again, using kind of these same demographic and policy variables. We allow for state or for metro area and year fixed effects. And then we're going to use variation in this DHAV variable over time to see if you are in a metro area where they increase the priority given to disabled households. Do we see that people are more likely to participate in SSI, kind of holding constant all the observable characteristics that we can about the household? And in particular, we have this nice measure of a self-reported disability indicator. So we can see if people who self-report having a disability are more or less likely to take up SSI, which is more of going through the verification process that Social Security has to determine if you're actually disabled from their verification or not. Next slide. The data we use to do this comes from the Current Population Survey, Annual Social and Economic Supplements. This is a nice cross-sectional survey that goes back to a very long time. We use it from 1988 to present because those are the years that have this self-reported disability question in it. We're limiting it to the 32 largest MSAs so that we have enough sample size to get a good measure of the MSA by year. And we're limiting our sample to household heads aged 18 to 60, again, because we're focused on the adult population in our analysis. Next. For our first stage results, you can just kind of see at a national level, there's been a pretty substantial increase in this disabled housing assistance preference over time. So you can read this as the percentage point increase in likelihood of receiving housing assistance if everything else is the same about you, but if you self-reported disability relative to not. And so overall, this is about a 7 percentage point increase in the likelihood of receiving housing assistance, or almost a doubling of the likelihood of receiving housing assistance if you're disabled relative to not. Next. And if you look at this by MSA, you can see a lot of variation over time in MSA's policy. So if you look at a place like, say, Boston or Minneapolis, you can see a really large increase in the preference given to disabled households for receiving housing assistance. But if you're in a place like Chicago, which uses the lottery, or Detroit, it's actually pretty constant and close to zero over time. And so it's this variation that we're going to use to try and look at the effect on SSI participation. It's within MSA over time. So does Boston and Minneapolis have a greater increase in the fraction of households on SSI relative to a place like Chicago and Detroit? Next. Just to summarize that DHAV variable, you can see that in the 1990s, on average, receiving SSI or self-reporting having a disability had a housing assistance value of about $850 per year, and that's increased to about $1,350 per year. And so again, this is the expected benefit, so it combines both the increased likelihood of receiving housing assistance times the benefit conditional on receiving it. Next. Next. I want to get to the results here since I'm going to run out of time. So for our main results here, what you can see in that first column, the very top coefficient is our coefficient of interest. This is saying that a $1,000 increase in the disabled housing assistance value, which is roughly a standard deviation increase, increases SSI participation by about 2.9 percentage points. And so this is going to imply that if DHAV was equal to 0, meaning that there was no preference given to disabled households, in 2018, that would predict that overall SSI recipients among the adult population would drop by about 25%, which is a pretty large effect, we think. Next. When we break up this effect by household composition, you can see that it's a somewhat similar effect among single parents relative to single women and single men, but that we see a fairly smaller effect, almost half the size, among married households, as we were expecting before. Next. And then if we similarly break up this effect by education level, you can see that the effect is almost twice as great among households that have below a high school education relative to those who either have a high school education, some college, or college. And so again, we think that this is at least evidence of a greater response among people who have either lower labor market opportunities or lower outside options through other aspects of the social safety net. Next. Somewhat surprisingly to us, when we look at spillovers onto other programs, it doesn't look like increased SSI participation lowers TANF participation, which to us just indicates that this would be more of either people who wouldn't have any access to the social safety net at all, not on TANF or SSI, or people who were in the labor market transitioned onto SSI as a result of this financial benefits. And we don't see any overlap with the SSDI program, which to us just indicates, again, these are more likely to be people who have lower labor market attachment overall, perhaps, as opposed to people who have a longer history and might qualify for SSDI. Next. And so just overall, what we think we find some nice evidence of here is that increasing access to housing assistance, increasing disabled preference for housing assistance has some effect on increasing SSI participation. And we also think that this is just nice documentation that this has been an increasing trend over time and something that public housing authorities should consider when they're deciding their policy to decide who should receive housing assistance and who shouldn't. But anyway, with that, I'd like to hand it over to Kathleen for some discussion. So,
great. Thank you, Eric. And thank you to CFS for putting this together. I really enjoyed learning about this study, and I look forward to Arthur's presentation as well. Before I start, I need to make a disclaimer that I don't represent any of the various assorted organizations I'm associated with. I'm speaking for myself, and these are my own opinions. Next slide. With that out of the way, I'm going to be talking about public housing authorities. I think they're really important stakeholders in the housing assistance system, and I think we know relatively little about them as organizations. So in support of that, we're going to talk a little bit about the context, and we're going to talk about the rationing and preferences as part of that. And then I'm going to offer up some ideas of how to work with PHAs to serve individuals with disabilities. And then if time allows, I'll make a few recommendations for this study. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of PHAs. There's nearly 4,000 of them when you consider those that offer vouchers and public housing. They have different service areas. Sometimes it's at the city or county or regional level. There are a few that operate at the state level. And in large metro areas, you'll find many of them working together. So in this study where the MSA is a unit of analysis, there's likely many housing authorities represented in a single MSA. On the other end of the spectrum, some PHAs serve a broad area pretty much exclusively. An example is Spokane Housing Authority in Western Washington that serves a 6-county area. Next slide. PHAs have different inventories. Their major programs are listed here. Some will have one, some will have all. I will just add another increasingly common program for PHAs is project-based vouchers, which is where the voucher is tied to a specific unit, and that voucher does not travel with the household. From the outside, it looks a lot like public housing, but on the funding side, it looks way different. Most housing authorities are very small in terms of inventory. About half of them have inventories of less than 250 units, meaning if they were at full capacity, they would be serving 250 households. Those small PHAs are most likely to only operate public housing. The largest PHAs are located in the largest metro areas, and they typically have more than one assistance program. And they hold most of the assistance. The 50 largest PHAs have about 35% of the overall U.S. inventory. Next slide, please. A PHA's inventory composition and size is constrained by federal rules. So there's a cap in the terms of units and dollars available to serve individuals and families. And so due to this, we have to ration this assistance. This is not an entitlement program. Meeting eligibility does not necessarily lead to receiving assistance. So PHAs need to develop approaches to select a subset from all the eligible households to receive an assistance. And I would say another wrinkle for PHAs is that the service duration for a particular unit, how long someone is in a unit or subsidy, is for the most part uncertain. In general, households can remain on assistance provided that they do not violate program rules and they remain income eligible, as Eric mentioned. So from the PHA perspective, it's uncertain when a particular unit will turn over. And once a unit turns over, you really want to have the next eligible household on deck ready to take over assistance as soon as possible, because being slow in responding to that turnover means that valuable assistance goes unused, and no one wants that. So we've got inventory constraints and uncertain turnover, so we need to develop a rationing approach to create a wait list of eligible households. And as Eric mentioned, PHAs have a lot of discretion over the attributes of this process. Some of those processes are listed here. The PHA's rationing approach is subject to public comment and PH board approval. So PHAs have to make these final decisions explicit in a system of administrative documents, and this information should be publicly discoverable. Next slide, please. We've heard a little bit about preferences already, mainly the disability preference. And so these preferences serve to target a population for program participation. Until 1998, there were 3 federal preferences, and they are listed here. But legislation around that time allowed PHAs to develop their own preferences. About 70% of PHAs have some system of local preferences in place, and some really common preferences are for displaced households, households with residency in the PHA's jurisdiction, the victims of domestic violence, the elderly, and of course, individuals with disabilities. PHAs vary in how preferences work. The ordering or hierarchy of preferences is really up to PHAs. And why do they matter so much? As Eric said, because the wait for assistance can be so long, right? Getting the highest waitlist placement is a big deal. It can shave years off the wait for assistance. So there's all these aspects of the rationing approach, and I thought it would be kind of fun to look at how some of these aspects look in the wild for actual PHAs. So we're going to look through some public notices that I just found of recent openings for these assistance programs. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we see an upcoming application period for a city PHA's HCV program starts next week. Folks can apply for about 2 months. Here we see that folks have to physically pick up an application, and they can only do so for 3 hours each weekday. Next slide. Here we see that they really only want mailed applications. You're kind of dead to them if you fax them in or hand deliver. And my guess here is that they're going to use that postmark to order folks on the wait list, which is a common process, particularly at smaller housing authorities. And here we see that their only preference is residing in the county. So what does this mean? All the folks that picked up an application, filled it out, mailed it, and had the right information on the application will be placed on the wait list, likely by the order of that postmark. And at the top of the wait list will be residents. At the bottom, we can also see discussion of the reasonable accommodation process, and this is another aspect of the application process where PHAs have some discretion. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we're moving to a different application period. It's for a public housing program. There's a 2-week period to apply through a web application. So you don't have to physically show up to obtain an application, but you do need to have a computer, internet access, and a viable email address. Next slide, please. Here we see that you have to have a household or 2 or more. So this starts to get in the wrinkle when the rationing for physical units that PHAs hold is a little more tricky because you have to connect individuals' attributes, households' attributes to the attributes of the public housing inventory. And I see that communicated here through this ad. So they're going to accept 500 applications within the unit size category. And if they receive more than that in any given category, they'll do a lottery. And then within these unit size categories, they're going to order by these preferences. And there are a set of preferences, and among one of them, we see individuals with disabilities. Next slide, please. And then here is just another example of reasonable accommodation. Here you see there are more modes to contact. One thing that really stood out to me here is that you had to get your reasonable accommodation request in before the start of the application period, which means you just have to know about it even more ahead of time. And next slide, please. And this is our last example. This is a project-based voucher opening. And I picked this one because it is explicitly targeting individuals with disabilities. This is for a single building. There are a bunch of 1-bedroom units and a few 2-bedroom units. And there's mention of on-site services that would be beneficial for individuals with disabilities. At the bottom, we see that there are multiple ways to apply, which is, I always think is a really great thing. Next slide, please. And here we see that date and time of application is going to set the order and then preferences. Preferences are live work, which is a common preference, and having a developmental disability or other disability that would benefit from on-site services. So here again, you see disability status being connected to the attributes of this property in these units. Next slide, please. Okay, so what? Like, I do hope that I've at least convinced you a bit that PHAs differ in a lot of ways, including how they ration access to housing assistance. And given that variation in housing inventories and rationing approaches, the opportunities for individuals with disabilities will vary within each community and over time. And then finally, it is administratively complex. It is absolutely complex for households trying to get assistance and also for PHAs trying to administer these programs in a fair and efficient way. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to offer a few ideas about how to work with a PHA if you are serving individuals with disabilities and you're not currently engaged with PHAs, given how valuable these benefits can be for these types of individuals and households. And I would say the very major thing is get to know your PHA or PHAs, given where you are. Examine their administrative documents, get to know how they do things, learn about their inventory. And then the next level would be to attend their public board meetings. All of these activities can give you an idea of the constraints and opportunities at your PHA. Look for opportunities to collaborate. Outreach, helping PHAs with outreach for application periods could be very beneficial. Maybe you could help them revamp their reasonable accommodation process. Does the PHA need to obtain supportive services for clients that don't have the benefit of living in service-enriched housing? They might want some help along those lines. Also, HUD puts out notices of funding opportunities that sometimes require PHAs to collaborate with community-based organizations that serve individuals with disabilities. So this could be a really great opportunity to partner. And then also just making sure information that should be public is actually public. Sometimes a PHA just needs a nudge to help make that come to be. And then additionally, clients need help navigating these processes. We've talked about waitlist application, but also staying on the waitlist, keeping your information up to date and not getting purged, and then preparing for using assistance. Next slide, please. Now recommendations for the study. One thing I was really curious about is the timing of participation. Like, what comes first, SSI or the housing assistance? And the CPS data are not the data to tease out this kind of nuance. So I would push you to maybe think about using administrative data sources. The HUD 50058 data would be a really great start to looking at this. Yeah, another thing I would recommend is really think about the underlying inventory, and keeping. I would be curious if you ran this with just vouchers and then just public housing, and see if anything is different. There has been also some policy changes. In '92, there was some pretty big changes to how housing authorities designated units for elderly and disabled households. And it would be good to learn about that. I mentioned the preference change as well. But then also there have been programs that explicitly target disabled households. In your discussion of Chicago, I'm pretty sure you were talking about the VASH program for veterans. Maybe thinking about when those programs came online, including mainstream vouchers. Another thing I would be curious is when sequestration was in place, does that change your models at all? And then you're looking at MSA, and I don't want to be tired about this, but MSA is not PHA, and so thinking, are there creative ways where you can get to PHA? And administrative data might allow you to be able to do that. With that, I am going to turn it over to Arthur. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. This has been a lot of great information. I'm learning a lot as well. So I'm going to present a local example of some of the challenges that people with disabilities face when finding housing. Next slide. There are three main hurdles. The first is accessibility, affordability, and also the process. Next slide. So let's, there we go. Let's look at an overview of the laws that govern accessibility, specifically in New York City. So in 1987, we passed a local law that implemented accessibility and adaptability in residential units, new construction, and major renovations. These standards were kind of ahead of their time. They're very similar to what was enacted several years later with the Fair Housing Act. New York apparently was just a little ahead of the game. So in 1991, the Fair Housing Act was passed, which really started that whole process of creating standards and promulgating regulations that really spelled out what this accessibility looked like and what adaptability looked like and how builders and developers can accomplish it. It took several years for the first set of guidelines to come out in '94. And, you know, as they've progressed, it's gotten more and more stringent and specific. And then the building code in New York City went through a refresh in 2008, which was also mandated by local law. And that really started the ball rolling on codifying those accessibility standards for usability and adaptability in buildings and in units. Every 6 years, it's required to go through an additional refresh, and those accessibility standards have just gotten strengthened and updated since then. We're expecting a new set of or new refresh of codes coming this year. We don't know when exactly, but they're working on it. So, and then New York City's human rights law, it's one of the most stringent in the country, actually, for two reasons with regard to housing, at least. One is that it widens or broadens the definition of disability by taking the federal definition and removing substantial from it. So it covers more situations that would be considered a disability, as well as, the Fair Housing Act mandated reasonable accommodations, but put the financial burden on the tenant. The New York City human rights law shifts that burden to the landlord. So any reasonable accommodations, modifications in the home or the building, it's the landlord's responsibility to do those, both physically and financially. Their only way to get out of it really is to show that that it's an unreasonable burden on them financially, or that it's just physically infeasible. And that can be a kind of high bar. The financial part of it, at least, can be a very high bar to reach here in the city. Next slide. So another barrier to accessibility in New York City, we're an old city. I chose these categories based on those laws that we talked about. So prior to 1988, which is when local law 58 was implemented, 90% of the building stock, residential building stock, was built prior to 1988. In those interim years before the code refresh and after local law 58, about 6% was built, and then new construction 2008 and forward, 4%. So as you can see, a very, very small percentage of residential buildings in New York City are obligated to use this, updated code that mandates usability and accessibility. So a lot of the complaints that I hear in my job come from people who live in buildings that don't have these mandates. And there's a lot of misconception about, well, we're grandfathered in, we don't have to do that. And they don't understand their obligation under human rights law that they have to provide the accommodation. Next slide. So let's talk about affordability. Low-income households, when you compare households with a person with a disability versus households without anybody with a disability, there are stark differences. As you can see, 73% of households with a disability are considered low income or very low, extremely low income. These are inclusive numbers, which is 20% higher than non-disabled households, and nearly double or more than double the amount are extremely low income. Next slide. And another, when you're talking about affordability, another issue is rent burden. When comparing disabled to non-disabled households, the rent burden, which is defined as spending more than 30% of your income on rent, and these are categorical, so it's 30 to less than 50% for rent burden, is about the same between disabled and non-disabled households. But when you look at extremely rent burdened, which is 50% or more of your income towards rent, we're talking, 60% increase in disabled households. And that, is a function of the low income status of disabled households and the small amount of subsidy that they get, from SSI, SSDI, typically is what the supplement is, or what their income is, compared to the high rents in New York City. Next slide. So in New York City, we have 3 different income-based housing that's available, or major amounts. There is some supportive housing that's not included here, but project-based is the smallest amount, and tenant-based, vouchers, and public housing are about the same amount. In total, it's about 400,000 units available for income-based housing for a city with, almost 9 million people. So that there's a huge disconnect there for the low-income population. And just so I forgot to mention this when we're looking at low income, I'm defining low income as 80% of the area median income, or less, and extremely low is 30% using the HUD standards. Next slide. So the process hurdles that we face, as Kathleen pointed out, the waiting lists can be years or decades long. Anecdotally, for NYCHA, which is the public housing, which provides public housing, it's one of the 3 PHAs in New York City, but the only provider of public housing. They have about 180,000 units, and less than 1% of them turn over annually. On their waiting list, they have about 250,000 people. So you can see there's a reason why I've heard people have waited more than 10 years before they're even called to get an apartment, to look at an apartment. And the Section 8 waiting lists for tenant-based Section 8, it's about the same. Project-based Section 8, those are the fastest waiting lists typically, where individual buildings can, you can have less than a year of a wait up to 3 or 4 years depending on the building. As Kathleen pointed out, the application process can be complex and burdensome. The documentation requirements alone can be burdensome. I've heard people who have complained about, spending $30, $40 on faxing materials to the PHA, or making copies, or having to take days off from work because they have to go to Social Security, or it can be very time-consuming and laborious to get the documentation needed. The rules are complex and can be multi-layered. Not everybody who's applying knows this or understands the rules. It can be hard to find them. Oftentimes they're written in kind of administrative talk, and legalese. It can be a little difficult to understand, especially if you're not a very good reader. And the policies can be rigid, particularly with regard to reasonable accommodations and how they define certain things like what a live-in aid is, and whether you qualify for an extra bedroom because of it. So that's everything for me. The next slide is my contact information. Feel free and reach out if you have questions.
Very good. Thank you so much, Eric, Kathleen, and Arthur. And now we do have some questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them, but we have quite a few that I'm going to start with. And first off, I'm going to ask Eric a question around your study. And I know, especially because you had mentioned that very significant rise in the type of disability. And so one of our audience members was wondering if your study does have a breakdown of recipients into groups such as physical disability, chronic illness or condition, developmental or emotional challenges, for example. Eric, I think you must be on mute.
Sorry, thank you. Yes. After I turned off mute. Yeah, so thank you. That's an interesting question. We're still trying to find the best way to show this. The short answer is the CPS data doesn't allow us to do this at all. What we can observe there is whether a household is on SSI or not, and we can observe whether they self-report having a work-limiting disability. So that's all that we can observe in that data. But we're working at the moment on, say, showing summary stats by the MSA on diagnosis codes, which is something that SSA does provide, but at the moment we don't have that to show, and especially changes over time. But we think that could be an interesting avenue to pursue.
Okay, thank you. And then this question I'm going to send to Kathleen first, but Eric, you also referred to this issue, as did Arthur, but Kathleen, I'm going to ask you, as this tends to be your area. So we talked a lot about the complexity, the administrative complexity, and I think Eric referred to, the cost. And so some audience members were wondering about if you're talking, and I think Arthur alluded to this as well, there is a cost, a financial cost to applying in some situations, and there's definitely a time burden. But is there any research, or is there anything that we can point to around how people are burdened by this, or how they are affected by this, impacted by this process financially, and also the cost of time perhaps being a financial, having financial ramifications as well?
I would say I think there's no formal study that really tries to nail down the costs, the time costs, and the burden of applying from the individual level. So that's a call to someone to make that work happen. I would say people have written about how complex the process is, but I think it's just something we should keep talking about and keep examining and keep encouraging PHAs to step away from processes that maybe are particularly burdensome or don't have a direct utility in identifying and making households ready for assistance. That's not a very satisfying answer, but yeah, I'm curious if anyone else has a different opinion.
I don't have a different opinion. I don't know of a number on the cost. I agree it's some high number likely, but it's really tough to quantify. It's certainly true that there's more studies on the SSI application part where you certainly can't work for 5 months, and that has a direct financial cost if you could have worked. And then the application procedure itself is usually a few $1,000s on the SSI side. But I've never seen a good reckoning of the cost of housing assistance policies.
And I'd be curious to look at how much control PHAs have over that process, how much of it is federally mandated, and how much of it they have control over.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for doing your best to answer that. And I have a question that I'm going to ask of you, Arthur. And I'm not sure how long you've been in your position, so how long you can kind of look back and talk about the effects of those laws that you mentioned when you were talking about accessibility. But in your experience, or just with your expertise, how have you seen an impact, positive impact from those laws those New York City laws that have been going into effect over the last several decades?
Well, certainly there has been a positive impact. Basically, when people come to us and say, I need to find accessible housing, my first line is to explain to them, well, the newer the building, the more likely it is to be accessible. Especially after 2008, because the accessibility was codified in building code. Before that, it was kind of recommendations and there was some guidance. I mean, it was law, but not everybody understood what accessibility looked like, how to do it, what the best practices were. And still, even though we run into issues because of the way the building code is enforced, like when an architect or developer puts in plans for a new building, they submit those plans, and there are instances where the architect can self-certify them. So basically they're saying, I've looked over these plans, I'm a certified architect, I know what's supposed to be in them based on building code, and I certify that these are all good. And so there isn't really much of a review process of those plans by the buildings department. And then when you look at building inspections as the building is being built, they don't have a specific check for accessibility in those inspections. There isn't, an accessibility inspection. So, they'll look at the plans, the way they're designed, and see how things are being built. And if there's a disconnect there, they maybe can catch some accessibility inaccessibility that's being provided. But if the architect self-certified and said, yes, this is all good, but they didn't really use best practices for accessibility, that's not necessarily going to be caught. So in the way that it's enforced, there's still some disconnect. So there definitely has been a positive impact, but there's much more work that needs to be done.
Thank you. Let's see, Eric, I'm gonna try to fit in one more question for you, because I think this is a really interesting question that came up as we kind of start to pull apart these numbers or try to think about this in an urban, suburban, kind of rural location. So does this data reflect urban, suburban, and rural locations? And if so, do you see differences between those locations, or are you able to even kind of sift like that?
Yeah, so I would say, our results are going to be some average of suburban and urban areas. We would love to be able to do more with rural areas, but that's more of just kind of a data limitation at the moment, that we can't really include rural areas very much, or at least to the extent that the rural areas are part of a metro area. And then we can't, again, we don't have the geographic information to really break out suburban versus urban too much in the CPS data. So we haven't been able to do that. Although it's certainly true that most of the, or a majority of the slots in each of these metro areas are for the kind of core city units. But it's less clear to us. We haven't quite seen an exact analysis about what fraction of people occupying those units came directly from the city, or if they were in the surrounding suburbs and applied to, say, the city of Chicago if you were living out in a suburb. So the shorter answer is we haven't been able to, but that would certainly be a great breakdown if we could do some more with that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And with that, we're right at time. And so I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to our presenters, Eric, Kathleen, and Arthur. We really appreciated you being here and sharing your knowledge and research. And I would like to let the audience know that this will be posted on our website, this webinar recording. We will post the slides as well. We have also a brief that we have posted, and we have another kind of practitioner-specific brief that will accompany this that's coming out as well. So look for those on our website. There will be a follow-up email with that link to the recorded webinar. And I'd also like to let everyone know that we do have a webinar coming up in the next month, and this will be called Child Care for Families Raising Children with Disabilities, the Role of Federal Policy in Equitable Access. So look for that date and registration coming to your inbox soon. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody and wish you a good day.
Thank you, Hallie.